After the gods fell silent. 1. Søren Kierkegaard, the single individual. I learned early what it is to live with a weight that cannot be seen. My father's house in Copenhagen was not poor, but it was heavy. Heavy with piety, with guilt, with the sense that a single wrong word might tip the whole soul into judgment. He had a genius for seriousness. He could make even a quiet evening feel like a trial. And yet I loved him. I loved the way he made thought feel like fate. He taught me that a human being is not merely an animal that eats, sleeps, and earns money. A human being is a question addressed to himself. But a question can be dodged. A question can be answered by everyone and therefore answered by no one. In my city, I watched that happen. I watched people dissolve into the public. The press could take a living person and turn him into a rumor. The crowd could take a difficult truth and turn it into a slogan. And the most dangerous thing about slogans is that they allow you to feel righteous without ever becoming responsible. I did not begin by calling my work existentialism. That word came later, after I was safely dead and could not protest the way my thoughts were arranged into a tidy school. I wrote because I could not breathe in the air of system. My century adored the idea that everything could be explained: history, society, God, and the self, like a map spread on a table. But a map has no pulse, and I was not writing about geography, I was writing about a life. So I did something scandalous. I refused to speak as a single author. I wrote under masks, pseudonyms, because the truth I sought was not a proposition but a transformation. There are truths that cannot be delivered like packages. They must be lived into. When I wrote either/or, I was not offering the world a clever puzzle. I was dramatizing two ways of existing: the aesthetic life that chases intensity and the ethical life that chooses commitment. The aesthetic life wants to be always beginning, always tasting, always drifting. The ethical life dares to say, "This is my responsibility, this is my vow." But then I discovered that even the ethical can be a form of hiding. One can become a respectable citizen and still avoid the deepest demand, the demand to stand alone before God, before conscience, before death. You want the origin of what you call existentialism? Then look here. I pushed the argument inward. I insisted that truth is not only what is correct in a lecture hall. There is another kind of truth, subjective truth. Truth is appropriation. I can know every doctrine about love and still never love. I can recite every argument about faith and still never risk my life upon it. I can defend Christianity in public and still never become a Christian in private. And private is where everything decisive happens. My own private life, yes, let us speak of it plainly, was cut by a choice that still stings. I was engaged to Regine Olsen. She was bright, alive, luminous in a way that made my inwardness feel like a shadow. I loved her, and I feared what my love would do to her. I feared that my melancholy and my vocation would devour her joy. So I broke the engagement. To the world it looked like cruelty, and perhaps it was. To me, it felt like a sacrifice whose meaning I did not fully grasp until later. There is a story in Scripture that haunted me: Abraham lifting the knife over Isaac. In fear and trembling, I wrote about him, not to praise violence, God forbid, but to expose the paradox at the heart of faith. Abraham cannot justify himself to the ethical. He cannot make a public speech that explains his act. He stands in the loneliness of the single individual, accountable in a way no committee can share. The moment you demand that faith be made reasonable to the crowd, you have already abandoned faith. But do not misunderstand me. I am not inviting you into irrationality for its own sake. I am inviting you into the terrifying discovery that the self is not a thing. The self is a relation that relates itself to itself, and in that relating either becomes whole or collapses. In the concept of anxiety, I tried to name the dizziness you feel when you realize you are free. Anxiety is not mere fear of a bear in the street. It is the vertigo of possibility. When you stand at the edge of what you could become, you feel the pull of the abyss, not because you want to die, but because you can choose. Freedom is not lightness. Freedom is weight, and then there is despair, that quiet sickness that wears many costumes. In the sickness. Unto death I call despair, the sickness of the self that does not want to be itself, or worse, the self that wants to be itself without the source that grounded it. Despair can look like boredom, like defiance, like endless busyness. It can look like success. It can look like a life filled with applause. But if the self is not anchored, if it refuses the task of becoming itself, then it is like a house built on mist. My era had a state church that made faith easy, respectable, almost automatic. I came to think that this ease was spiritual anesthesia. In the end, I fought the comfortable Christianity of Denmark, not because I wanted to destroy faith, but because I wanted to rescue it from complacency. I wanted to strip away the social costume and leave the individual trembling before the real demand. Become. If you live now, in your century of screens and constant commentary, do you think you have escaped the public? No, the public has simply learned new instruments. You are surrounded by voices that want to tell you what to desire, what to fear, what to call authentic. You can become a crowd even while alone in your room. You can be liked and still be lost. You can be informed and still be asleep. So I tell you what I told my own age. Do not confuse noise with meaning. Do not confuse the approval of the many with the truth of your life. There is a place in you that cannot be delegated. There is a decision that no one can make for you. And you will not meet yourself in the crowd. You will meet yourself where you dare to stand alone, an individual, not an echo. 2. Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Underground of the Heart. I have stood before a firing squad with my eyes open. It is strange what the mind does in the last minutes. It becomes meticulous. The snow looks whiter than it ever has. The air feels cut with glass. You notice the absurd details, the way a soldier shifts his weight, the way a strap creaks. And you think with a calm that is not calm at all. So this is how the world ends. Not with a theory, not with a sermon, just with a command. I was 28 when they marched us out in St. Petersburg for our mock execution. We had been arrested for meetings and readings, dangerous words, they said. We were lined up, and the sentence was read, and the preparations began. Then, at the last moment, the reprieve arrived. A theatrical mercy, a lesson carved into the nerves. Your life is not yours. After that came Siberia, the prison camp in Omsk, the years of exile, the company of men who had done real crimes, and men who had been punished for thoughts. In that hell I learned that the soul is not improved by suffering the way iron is improved by fire. Suffering reveals, it exposes what was hidden. Some men became beasts, some men became saints, most were something terrible in between. I carried with me the New Testament, not because it was a charm, but because it was a voice that spoke from deeper than the state. I watched human beings who had nothing, no rights, no dignity, no future, still cling to a kind of inward freedom that no guard could confiscate. And I watched other human beings in the same barracks choose cruelty as if it were a pleasure. If you want to understand existence, do not begin with abstractions. Begin with a man who has been humiliated and ask what he will do next. When I returned to writing, I could not write polite novels. I wrote as if the paper were a confession booth and a courtroom at once. My century was intoxicated with reason, especially a kind of reason that believed it could engineer happiness. If you can calculate the greatest good, they said, then human beings will obediently choose it. If you can build the perfect system, they said, then suffering will evaporate like mist. I laughed, but not kindly, because I had met the creature called man. In Notes from Underground, I gave him a voice, petty, brilliant, self-lacerating, furious at the idea that he could be reduced to a formula. The underground man is sick, yes, but his sickness is a kind of protest. He would rather choose what harms him than be told he must choose what benefits him. Why? Because he wants to prove he is not a piano key that can be played by social laws. He wants to assert something irrational and stubborn. I am free, even if my freedom is self-destructive. This is the problem your existentialists later inherit. Freedom is not automatically noble. Freedom can be spite. Freedom can be refusal. Freedom can be the will to say no. just to feel the taste of no on the tongue. And then I wrote Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov is not only a murderer, he is a thinker intoxicated by his own theory. He divides humanity into ordinary and extraordinary, those who must obey and those who may transgress for the sake of a higher purpose. He kills to prove he belongs to the second category, but the murder does not elevate him, it fractures him. His mind becomes a courtroom, his body a witness. He discovers what no manifesto teaches. Guilt is not merely social, it is metaphysical. You can argue yourself into permission, but you cannot argue your conscience into silence. In my novels, the question of God is never merely theological, it is existential. If God is absent, what holds the human being together? If there is no ultimate judge, what restrains the cruelty of the powerful or the despair of the weak? My characters circle this question like moths around a flame, even Karamazov in The Brothers. Karamazov cannot accept a universe in which innocent children suffer. He returns his ticket, as it were, and in his rebellion he becomes vulnerable to a darker logic. If there is no divine order, then perhaps anything is permitted. But notice, I do not present faith as a simple answer. Faith is not a clean syllogism. Faith is lived in bodies that ache, in homes that break, in societies that grind people into dust. Alyosha's faith is not an argument. It is a way of being with others, a tenderness that does not deny suffering, but refuses to let suffering be the final word. And then there is the Grand Inquisitor, the old cardinal who tells Christ that human beings cannot bear freedom. They want bread, miracles, authority. They will trade their souls for certainty. This is not only a Catholic parable, it is a human one. People fear the burden of choosing. They crave a manager for their conscience. Do you see how this connects to your world? You have more choices than my century could imagine, and yet you often seem more eager to surrender your choices to machines, to trends, to parties, to crowds. You want someone to tell you what to think, who to hate, what to buy, how to live. Freedom is exhausting. It demands that you become the author of your life rather than the consumer of someone else's script. But I also know what happens when freedom is stripped away by force. I have lived under the boot. I have watched ideology turn human beings into numbers. That is why I insist the real drama is inside. Revolutions that ignore the heart become new prisons. Systems that promise paradise often create laboratories of cruelty. Existentialism, if you wish to trace it through me, is the discovery that the human being is not a rational unit, but a mystery capable of contradictory longings. Longing for God and longing for destruction, longing for love and longing for domination, longing for truth and longing for self-deception. It is the discovery that the underground is not a place beneath the city, but a place beneath the self, a cellar where resentment, pride, shame, and hunger whisper to each other. And yet I do not end in darkness. I have seen men in chains share their last crust of bread. I have seen a prostitute become a saint. I have seen a murderer redeemed, not by a theory, but by a suffering love that refuses to let him be only his worst act. Perhaps that is my offering to your century. Do not sentimentalize humanity, but do not despair of it either. The self is not a machine. It is a battlefield. It is a prayer. It is a question that bleeds. If existentialism later speaks of angst and freedom and responsibility, remember that I learned these words in the cold breath of Siberia, where the soul had nowhere to hide. 3. Friedrich Nietzsche, After the Death of God. I did not set out to be a prophet, I set out to be honest. Honesty, however, is a violent thing when it is pursued without compromise. It cuts through comforts like a blade through cloth. It makes enemies of the consolations that keep whole civilizations asleep. I was trained as a philologist, an anatomist of ancient texts. I studied the Greeks because I suspected they had stared into the abyss without blinking. They knew tragedy. They knew that existence is not justified by happiness, and yet they danced. They invented art, not as decoration but as a response to terror. When I wrote The Birth of Tragedy, I was still entangled with Wagner, still dazzled by the possibility of a modern Dionysian renewal. I believed music could rescue Europe from its thin rationalism. I was wrong about Wagner. He wanted a new church. I wanted the courage to live without one. Then my body became my tutor. Illness drove me out of institutions and into wandering. Basel, where I had become a professor absurdly young, could no longer contain me. I lived in rented rooms in mountain air, in the solitude that either destroys you or clarifies you. Pain is a cruel editor. It cuts away what you cannot afford to believe. And in that solitude I saw it, the great event, hiding in plain sight. God is dead, not as a metaphysical proof, not as a clever insult, but as a cultural fact. The Christian God, the guarantor of meaning, the anchor of morality, the cosmic accountant, this God had lost his power over the European conscience. People continued to attend church and speak pious phrases, but their lives were already governed by other gods: science, progress, nation, comfort. They still used God's moral vocabulary, but they no longer believed in God's reality. This is what terrified me. Not atheism, but nihilism. The vacuum left when the old values collapse and nothing strong enough replaces them. You may think the death of God makes everything simple. It does not. It makes everything perilous. Because if the old "thou shalt" dissolves, the human being must become the creator of value, or else become a consumer of borrowed values, a parasite on a corpse. I looked around and saw a civilization drifting toward the last man, the creature who wants above all to be comfortable, safe, entertained, the creature who sneers at greatness as if greatness were a sickness, the creature who says we have invented happiness and means by happiness a life without risk. Do not mistake me. I do not worship suffering for its own sake. I despise moralities that glorify pain as a ticket to heaven. But I also despise the cowardice that flees struggle, because struggle is where the human being becomes more than a well-fed animal. If you remove the possibility of failure and tragedy, you also remove the possibility of excellence. I wrote in aphorisms because I wanted to strike like lightning, not build like a bureaucrat. A system is a prison, a hammer is a test. I began to test morality itself. On the genealogy of morals, one asked, where did our moral concepts come from? Who benefits when a society praises meekness and condemns strength? How did good become associated with self-denial? How did guilt become a tool? Here I discovered resentment, the hidden revenge of the powerless who cannot act openly. Resentment creates a morality that condemns what it envies. It calls strength evil, calls submission good, calls life's instincts sin. It makes a virtue out of weakness, not because weakness is truly noble, but because weakness needs a narrative that saves its pride. You will accuse me, many have, of celebrating cruelty, but I am diagnosing the cruelty already inside moral systems that pretend to be pure. There is nothing more vicious than a sanctimonious conscience. What then is the alternative? Not a return to old faith, not an empty skepticism. The alternative is the revaluation of values, the courage to ask what kind of human being your morality produces, and whether that human being is worthy of existence. In my loneliest writing, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I tried to speak as a poet of transformation. The Overman, Übermensch, is not a comic book hero. It is the image of a human being who has overcome the need for metaphysical guarantees. A human being who can say yes to life even in its cruelty, even in its impermanence, even in its senselessness. Yes, that is the hard word. Not optimism, not naive cheer, but amor fati, love of fate, love of the whole, including the wound. And then there is the thought that visited me like a storm, eternal recurrence. Imagine, I said, that you must live this life again and again, every joy and every shame, every trivial hour, forever. Would you curse the demon who announced it? Or would you answer, you are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine? This thought is not a cosmology, it is a test. It asks whether you live as if you could affirm your existence without appeal. Do you see why later existentialists find me both poisonous and necessary? Because I tear away the comfort of inherited meaning, and in doing so I force the question, if there is no given essence, no divine blueprint, then what is a human being? I did not speak the later slogan, "Existence precedes essence," but I helped clear the ground on which it could be uttered. I showed what happens when the heavens are emptied. The human being stands trembling, either collapsing into nihilism or daring to become a creator. But here I must confess something that makes my readers uneasy. My philosophy is not separable from my temperament. I was a man of solitude and intensity. I loved the air of the mountains because it made thinking sharp. I despised the herd because I feared becoming it. My writing is a wound that learned to speak. And then at the end my mind broke. The body that had carried so much fire could not bear it. Others took my name and used it for things I would have despised. They turned my critique of herd morality into a justification for brute power. They took my language and fitted it to uniforms. This is the danger of ideas. Once released, they can be adopted by the very forces they were meant to resist. So let me speak to your century plainly. If you live after the death of God, you cannot live by mere negation. You must become responsible for the meaning you inhabit. Otherwise, you will drift toward new idols, ideologies, tribes, algorithms, the narcotic of endless distraction, and you will call that drift freedom. Freedom is not the absence of chains. Freedom is the courage to create without guarantees. And if you cannot yet create, then at least do this. Become suspicious of any morality that flatters your weakness. Become suspicious of any certainty that requires you to stop thinking. Become suspicious of any crowd that offers belonging at the price of your soul. Existence is not a problem to be solved. It is a challenge to be affirmed. 4. Martin Heidegger, Being, Time, and the They. I did not begin with ethics. I began with a question so old it had become invisible. What does it mean to be? Philosophy in my time had become clever, technical, proud of its methods. It debated knowledge, categories, consciousness, important matters, yes, but it forgot something more basic. Before you know anything, you already are. And your being is not an object on a table. It is the very condition that lets objects appear. I grew up near the Black Forest. The paths, the weather, the wood smoke. These were not scenery to me. They were a way the world disclosed itself. Later, when I worked in my hut at Tottenauberg, I learned again what the city makes easy to forget. Thinking is not only a matter of arguments. It is a matter of attunement. The forest teaches you that the world is not first a collection of things, but a field of meanings in which you are already involved. When I wrote Being and Time, I tried to bring philosophy back to existence, not as psychology, not as biography, but as ontology. I spoke of Dasein, the being for whom being is an issue. Human existence is not just present like a rock, it is concerned, projected, thrown. You find yourself already in a world you did not choose, language, customs, history, yet you are always ahead of yourself, reaching toward possibilities. This is what later readers call existential, though I did not mean it as a mood or a fashion. I meant it as the structure of being there. Most people, most of the time, do not live in the sharpness of their own possibility. They live in what I call das Man, the they. The they says one does this, one thinks that one ought to want this. The they is not a conspiracy, it is everydayness itself, the anonymous comfort of conformity. In the they, you are never fully guilty, never fully responsible, because you are only doing what one does. The they speaks through idle talk. It turns everything into something to be repeated. It gives the feeling of understanding without the labor of understanding. And it is seductive because it spares you the anxiety of choosing. But anxiety arrives anyway. There is a mood, angst, that does not fear a particular thing but reveals the nothingness beneath your taken-for-granted world. In anxiety, the familiar loses its grip. The tools you use daily no longer reassure you. The they no longer sounds convincing. You feel exposed to the sheer fact that you exist without a script. This is not a pathology. It is a disclosure. Anxiety shows you that you are free, not in the sense of a consumer choosing between products, but in the sense of a being who must take up its own being. And then there is death. Death is not merely the event that ends biological life. Death is the possibility that is always mine, that no one can take over for me, that individualizes me. You can delegate tasks, beliefs, even relationships, but you cannot delegate dying. When you face death honestly, you face the truth that your time is finite, and finitude gives weight to choice. It makes existence urgent. To be authentic, eigentlich, is not to become a unique eccentric. It is to own your being toward death, to live as a finite being who chooses rather than drifts. Authenticity does not mean isolation from others. It means refusing to let the they be the final authority over your possibilities. This is why the later existentialists found in my work a vocabulary for their own struggles: thrownness, projection, fallenness, authenticity. Yet they often turned these words into slogans. They made them psychological, moral, even fashionable. I meant them as ontological structures, ways the world and self are disclosed. And now I must speak of a darker disclosure, the way a philosopher can fail the very authenticity he analyzes. In 1933, I became rector at Freiburg and joined the Nazi Party. I told myself this is the truth, that a political movement might renew the German university, might awaken a destiny, might rescue a people from rootlessness. The language of destiny is intoxicating. It makes personal responsibility feel like participation in a grand narrative. But grand narratives are precisely where the they becomes most dangerous. What happened was not simply an error of judgment. It was a collapse into the very anonymity I described. I allowed a collective frenzy to substitute for thinking. I allowed the they of a nation to speak louder than the quiet question of being. And the consequences, human consequences, were monstrous. I will not offer you excuses dressed as philosophy. If existential thought means anything, it means you cannot hide behind abstractions. A thinker who speaks of authenticity and then submits to brutality does not merely contradict himself. He reveals how thin thinking becomes when it refuses ethical responsibility. After the war, people demanded statements, confessions, denunciations. I spoke too little, and what I spoke was often evasive. Silence can be a form of cowardice. Perhaps my later work, my turn toward language, poetry, the clearing where being appears, was also a way of fleeing the political stain. Perhaps I wanted to retreat to the forest where questions are clean, but the world is not clean. Existence is not clean. So what remains of my contribution? This. I tried to show that human beings are not minds floating above reality. We are beings in the world. We understand through practices, through tools, through relationships, through time. Meaning is not glued onto a neutral world. Meaning is how the world first shows up. And this matters for your century, because you live in an age of constant information that often lacks understanding. You can be saturated with data and still be lost in the they. You can repeat slogans about identity, politics, virtue, and progress, and still never ask the simplest question: what kind of being am I becoming? Existentialism, in the wake of my work, becomes the insistence that the human being is not an object to be managed. He is a being whose existence is at stake, whose time runs out, whose life cannot be lived by proxy. To forget that is to fall asleep in the they. To remember it is to wake up, perhaps in anxiety, perhaps in shame, perhaps in clarity, and begin again. 5. Jean-Paul Sartre, Condemned to be Free. I first felt nausea, not in my stomach, but in my metaphysics. It happened in ordinary places: a park bench, a cafe table, a street where people walked as if their roles were nailed to their bodies. I looked at a tree root, just a root, gnarled, obscene in its sheer presence, and I realized that existence has no reason. It simply is. It bulges, it overflows, it refuses justification. That realization became nausea. Roquentin is not merely sick, he is awake to the contingency that most people cover with habits and labels. A chair, a citizen, a good man. These words are useful, but they can also become narcotics. They let you forget the raw fact that things are not necessary. They might not have been. You might not have been. Then came the war, mobilization, boredom, fear, the collapse of Europe's self-confidence into uniforms and ruins. I was captured and held as a prisoner of war. In the camp, even there, freedom persisted, not as comfort, but as responsibility. You can be imprisoned and still choose how you interpret, how you resist, how you become. You can also collaborate inwardly, surrender your mind long before your body is released. When I wrote Being and Nothingness, I wanted to describe consciousness without hiding behind God. Consciousness is not a thing, it is a lack, a nothingness that opens space in being. Because I can imagine what is not, I am not identical to what is. I am always beyond myself. This is the source of my freedom and my anguish. People want to treat themselves as objects because objects are innocent. A rock is never guilty. A knife is never ashamed. But I cannot become a rock. I am a being who chooses, even when I claim not to choose. This is why I spoke of bad faith, the lies we tell ourselves to escape freedom. The waiter who plays at being a waiter as if his role were his essence. The woman on a date who pretends her body is not making a decision. The citizen who says, I had no choice, while quietly enjoying the comfort of obedience. Bad faith is not simple hypocrisy. It is a sophisticated self-deception in which the self tries to be both free and not free at once. And then there is the other. I learned in cafes and love affairs and political arguments that the gaze of another person can transform you. When I feel myself seen, I become aware of myself as an object in the world, something that can be judged, categorized, used. Shame is the experience of being pinned by another's look. Yet the other is also the condition of my humanity. I cannot escape the social world without escaping language, history, and love. So existence is conflict and entanglement. We are freedoms colliding. After the war, existentialism became a public word. People wore it like a scarf, like a scandal, like a badge of modern despair. They came to my lecture, Existentialism is a humanism, expecting an excuse for nihilism. I gave them instead a demand. If God does not exist, there is no human nature written in heaven. There is no essence that precedes your life. You are not born with a script. You exist first, you appear in the world, and then, through your actions, you define yourself. Existence precedes essence. This is not liberation into emptiness. It is liberation into responsibility. Because if you are what you do, then you are answerable for what you make of yourself. And it goes further. In choosing myself, I choose an image of the human. My actions imply a view of what anyone should do in my situation. This is why existentialism is not selfish, it is ethically weighty. My freedom is not a private treasure, it is a public burden. But I also learned that freedom is not exercised in a vacuum. We live in situations, economic, political, bodily, historical. We do not choose the cards, but we choose how to play them. Later, as I engaged more deeply with Marxism and politics, I tried to think freedom together with structure, responsibility together with oppression. I did not always succeed. I was tempted, like many intellectuals, to excuse horrors because they were committed in the name of history. That temptation is a betrayal of existentialism's core. No future utopia absolves present cruelty. I lived my life with Simone de Beauvoir in a partnership that scandalized bourgeois morality. We refused marriage not because we despised commitment, but because we wanted to invent our own. We made pacts, broke them, endured jealousy, wrote, argued, returned. Our lives were laboratories of freedom, messy, painful, sometimes dishonest, sometimes luminous. Do you want existentialism as a story rather than a lecture? Then take this. A human being is not a substance but a project. You are always becoming, and that becoming is not guaranteed to be good. You can choose cowardice. You can choose cruelty. You can choose comfort over truth. And when you do, you cannot wash your hands by blaming your nature because your nature is what you have made. In your century, bad faith has new costumes. People hide behind identities as if labels were destinies. People hide behind algorithms as if recommendation were necessity. People hide behind the phrase, everyone says, as if the crowd were a conscience. People declare themselves powerless while endlessly consuming, an activity that feels passive but shapes the world through demand. Existentialism confronts you with an unbearable simplicity. You are responsible. Not in the moralizing sense of being blamed for everything, but in the existential sense that you cannot escape being the author of your meaning. Even your refusal to choose is a choice. Even your silence is a statement. That is why the philosophy tastes like metal. It does not flatter. It does not console with myths. It says you are free, therefore you are in danger, therefore you must become lucid. And if you ask me for hope, I give you not certainty, but action. Meaning is not found like a coin on the street. Meaning is made together, in struggle, in commitment, in the refusal to lie. 6. Simone de Beauvoir, Ambiguity, Situation, and Becoming. When I was a girl, I wanted to be exemplary. I wanted to be good in the way adults meant it. Obedient, pious, destined for a respectable life. I was intelligent, and intelligence in a young girl is often treated as a decoration, something charming so long as it does not threaten the order of things. I saw early how society arranges women like furniture, placed, praised, used, inherited. And then I lost my faith, not in a dramatic thunderclap, but through a slow recognition that the world did not match the story I had been told. If God existed, he was curiously absent from the actual suffering of people. I began to suspect that morality could not be outsourced to heaven. It had to be made in the muddy world of human relations. That is where my existentialism begins, not as a flirtation with despair, but as a demand that ethics be real. When I met Sartre, I met someone who treated me as a mind rather than an ornament. We made ourselves into companions of thought. We read, wrote, argued, walked Paris until dawn. We made a pact to tell each other the truth, an ambition that was sometimes beautiful and sometimes cruel. But we shared a conviction. The human being is not a fixed essence. The human being is freedom in situation. This phrase matters, in situation. Philosophers love to speak of freedom as if it were a pure, abstract power, but freedom is always embodied, gendered, located, constrained. It is exercised in a world that resists, and because it resists, freedom becomes an ethical problem rather than a mere metaphysical one. In the ethics of ambiguity, I tried to name what our lives actually feel like. We are both fact and transcendence. We are bodies that age, that hunger, that can be wounded. And we are also projects that reach beyond ourselves, imagining futures, choosing values. We are not angels and not stones. We are ambiguous. This ambiguity is not a flaw to be eliminated by system. It is the condition of meaning. To be human is to be unfinished. But the world does not like unfinished beings. Society prefers categories. It prefers roles. It prefers to turn living projects into stable objects. And this is what it has done to women for centuries. It has made woman into the other. I did not write the second sex as a complaint. I wrote it as an investigation, almost an autopsy, of how an entire half of humanity has been shaped into a secondary existence. Biology is invoked, psychology is invoked, myth is invoked, religion is invoked, but beneath these justifications lies a simpler fact. Men have defined themselves as the subject and defined women as the relative, the inessential, the supporting caste. I wrote a sentence that has followed me like a shadow. One is not born a woman, one becomes one. I meant woman is not merely a biological fate. It is a social process, a history written on the body. A girl learns to shrink, to please, to fear, to measure herself by the gaze of others. She is taught that her freedom is dangerous, that her desire is shameful, that her mind is excessive. And then she is blamed for the very limitations imposed on her. Existentialism, as I lived it, could not remain a private meditation on death and meaning. It had to become political, because oppression is not only a set of laws, it is a theft of possibility. To oppress someone is to reduce her transcendence, to trap her in immanence, to confine her to repetitive, thankless labor, to deny her the projects through which she becomes herself. And yet, I refused a simple victim narrative. If existentialism is true, then even within constraint there is agency, not unlimited, not romantic, but real. The oppressed person is not a thing, she is still a subject, still capable of refusal, solidarity, invention. Liberation is not given, it is made, often slowly, painfully, with setbacks and betrayals. My own life taught me this in ways both personal and public. I saw how love can become a cage when it demands that a woman make herself smaller. I saw how motherhood can be sanctified into destiny. I saw how respectability is used as a leash. And I saw, too, how women can internalize the leash and call it virtue. In your century, new forms of constraint appear. You may think you are freer because you can work, vote, speak, and you are freer in many ways, thanks to struggles that were not inevitable. But freedom is always threatened by new myths. Today, perhaps the myth is that you must turn yourself into a product, curate your body, your life, your opinions for constant display. You can be empowered and still imprisoned by the gaze, still measuring your worth by external metrics. Existentialism asks, who is doing the choosing here? Is it you or the invisible pressure of they? I want to tell you what I learned. Freedom is not a feeling, it is a practice. It is the sustained effort to live without lying to yourself, to recognize the ways you are situated, and to work, alone and with others, to expand the realm of genuine possibility. And ethics, in this view, is not a list of commandments. It is the commitment to will the freedom of others, because my freedom is not complete if it is built on someone else's confinement. If I treat another person as an object, I diminish my own humanity as well. Existentialism is sometimes accused of being gloomy, but what could be more hopeful than insisting that people are not fixed, that history is not fate, that the self can be remade, that oppression can be named and therefore fought? The price of this hope is ambiguity. There are no guarantees. There is no final purity. You will make mistakes. You will be tempted by bad faith. You will want someone else to decide for you, but you can begin again. You can become. 7. Albert Camus, The Absurd Sun and the Rebel's Measure. I was born into poverty and sunlight. Algeria is not a metaphor to me. It is a smell. The sea, dust, sweat, eucalyptus. My father died in the First World War when I was a baby. My mother was nearly silent, worn down by work and hardship. In our small apartment, there was little talk and no philosophical education. But there was the world itself, the brightness that makes you feel both alive and exposed. I played football as a goalkeeper. I learned something important in that position. You stand alone, watching the whole field, responsible for a moment that can ruin everything. It is a role of alertness and humility. Later, tuberculosis took the sport from me. Illness teaches you finitude in a language the intellect cannot translate away. When I began to write, I did not begin with the question, what is the meaning of life? I began with a more immediate sensation, the strangeness of being alive in a world that does not answer you. There is a silence at the heart of reality. We ask for meaning, for justice, for an order that fits our longing, and the world replies with indifferent facts. The sun rises, the body fails, people die, suffering happens without reason. This collision between our hunger for clarity and the world's refusal is what I called the absurd. The absurd is not a theory, it is an experience. It is the moment you realize that your routines, work, habit, chatter, are thin veils over a deeper question. Why do I get up? Why do I do any of this? And if there is no ultimate answer, what then? In the myth of Sisyphus, I asked what seemed to me the only serious philosophical question: whether life is worth living. Suicide is the temptation of the absurd, the temptation to resolve the conflict by leaving the stage. But I refused that escape. I also refused the opposite escape, the leap into false consolation, the invention of metaphysical answers that soothe but lie. Between suicide and false hope, there is another option: revolt. To revolt is to say, yes, the world is silent, but I will not consent to despair. I will live without appeal. I will imagine Sisyphus happy. Not because his task is secretly meaningful, but because his refusal to surrender gives him a strange dignity. The gods can condemn his body, but they cannot force his inner consent. Then came the war, and the absurd became political. Under occupation, the silence of the world was joined by the shouting of propaganda. I worked in the resistance newspaper Combat. I wrote not as a detached observer, but as a man who had to decide, what does decency require when the world is on fire? This is where some people misunderstand me. They think absurdism means indifference. It does not. The absurd strips away illusions. It does not strip away compassion. If anything, it makes compassion more urgent because there is no cosmic justice to guarantee that suffering will be redeemed. If we do not act, nothing will. In The Stranger, Meursault is often read as a monster of apathy, but he is also an indictment of a society that demands the performance of meaning. Meursault is condemned less for killing a man than for not crying correctly at his mother's funeral. The court cannot tolerate a person who refuses the script, and yet his honesty is limited. He is not a saint. He is simply a man living on the surface of sensation, refusing lies but also refusing deeper responsibility, until the confrontation with death forces him into clarity. In The Plague, I try to show another response to absurdity, solidarity. A plague is not a moral drama. It is a fact. It arrives, it spreads, it kills. The question is not why, but what do we do? Dr. Rieu fights the plague not because he believes he will win forever, but because he refuses to be complicit. He chooses what I consider the modest heroism of doing one's job, of tending to the suffering because suffering is there. Later I wrote The Rebel, and there I stepped onto a minefield. The 20th century was full of revolutions that promised paradise and delivered mass graves. I wanted to understand rebellion without becoming an apologist for murder. I argued that revolt begins with a no, a refusal of humiliation, but that true revolt also implies a yes, a recognition of a common human dignity that sets limits. This insistence on limits made enemies. Some wanted total purity, total revolution, total justification by history. They treated human beings as raw material. I could not accept that. If you kill in the name of justice, you risk becoming the plague you claim to cure. My break with Sartre was painful. We had been comrades in the struggle against fascism, but we diverged on the question of political violence and ideological excuses. I did not believe that ends sanctify means. I did not believe that suffering can be calculated into righteousness. Existentialism and absurdism in my hands were not invitations to despair, but disciplines of lucidity, to live without lies, to refuse both nihilism and fanaticism, to act as if justice mattered, even though the universe does not guarantee it. Do you see how this speaks to your world? You live amid crises that feel like plagues, pandemics, climate disaster, wars broadcast like entertainment, political hysteria, loneliness disguised as connectivity. You may feel absurdity not as philosophy but as exhaustion, scrolling through tragedies you cannot fix, living in systems that seem too vast to change, feeling your own life shrink into routines. I cannot give you certainty. I can give you a stance. Begin with lucidity. Name what is. Refuse comforting lies. But do not stop there. Choose revolt. Not the murderous revolt of ideology, but the human revolt that says, I will not add to suffering. I will resist humiliation. I will stand with others in the dark. The absurd does not cancel love. It sharpens it. And if there is any salvation in this silent universe, it is not in doctrine. It is in the fragile, stubborn act of solidarity, in becoming for a moment the meaning the world does not provide. 8. Irvin Yalom, Existentialism in the Therapy Room. I did not meet existentialism in a cafe full of philosophers. I met it in a room with 2 chairs. In that room, people came to me with symptoms. Panic, depression, compulsions, addictions, relationships that kept breaking like the same glass dropped again and again. They wanted techniques, they wanted relief. Sometimes I could offer that. But beneath the symptoms, again and again, I found the same deeper currents. Questions that no medication can fully silence. I began to think of these currents as the givens of existence. Not because they are bleak, but because they are unavoidable. There are four I return to: death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. Death is the obvious one, and yet people spend most of their lives trying not to know it. They live as if tomorrow were guaranteed, and then something happens: a diagnosis, an accident, the death of a friend, a news story that suddenly feels personal. The shield cracks. Panic often enters through that crack, not because death is new, but because the person has been living on borrowed denial. In therapy, I watched death anxiety disguise itself as many things: workaholism, perfectionism, obsession with health, phobias, rage. People do not say, "I am terrified of non-being." They say, "I can't breathe," or "I can't stop checking," or "I can't sleep." The body speaks what the mind refuses to articulate. Freedom is the next given, and it surprises people that I call it a burden. They think freedom means doing whatever you want. But existential freedom is deeper. It means there is no ultimate structure that guarantees your choices are correct. You are the author, and authors can fail. They can write terrible stories. They can waste chapters. Many patients are trapped not by external chains, but by the fantasy that someone else is responsible. They blame their parents, their partner, their boss, their childhood, their genes, their culture. Some of these forces are real and powerful. But even within constraint, there is always a zone of choice, sometimes tiny but present. Therapy often becomes the painful work of reclaiming that zone and tolerating the anxiety it brings. Isolation is perhaps the most heartbreaking given. Not the ordinary loneliness of being single on a Friday night, but existential isolation. The fact that no one can enter your consciousness completely. No one can die for you. No one can fully remove your responsibility. Even in love, there is a distance. Two inner worlds touch but do not merge. This is why people sometimes use relationships as anesthesia. They cling, merge, control, seduce, anything to avoid that fundamental aloneness. But the paradox is that when you try to annihilate isolation by possessing the other, you destroy intimacy. Real connection requires two separate selves choosing each other, not two frightened selves fusing to avoid the abyss. And then there is meaninglessness. People often arrive saying, "I don't know what's wrong with me," and eventually they confess, "I don't know why I'm here." In a secular age, many of the old structures that provided meaning, religion, stable community, clear rites of passage, have weakened. People float. They have pleasure, but not purpose. They have stimulation, but not significance. Existentialism, as I learned it, does not hand you meaning like a prescription. It asks you to create meaning through commitment, to projects, to relationships, to values that you enact rather than merely admire. Meaning is not something you find under a rock. It is something you build, and you build it in time, with finitude pressing on your shoulder. When I wrote Existential Psychotherapy, I tried to bring these philosophical insights into clinical practice. Some colleagues accused existential therapy of being too abstract, but the therapy room taught me the opposite. Philosophy becomes concrete when it meets a human being who cannot sleep at night because she suddenly realizes she will die. When a man keeps sabotaging his relationships because intimacy threatens his illusion of invulnerability. When a woman achieves everything she was told to want and still feels empty because the achievements were never her own choices. In my work, I often return to the thinkers who preceded me: Kierkegaard's despair, Nietzsche's demand for self-creation, Heidegger's being toward death, Sartre's bad faith, Beauvoir's situated freedom, Camus' revolt. But I did not treat them as museum pieces. I treated them as maps for living. Let me tell you what I learned in story form. A patient once told me he was terrified of flying. He had built his life around avoiding planes. We worked on the fear, the bodily sensations, the catastrophic thoughts. But the deeper truth emerged slowly. His father had died suddenly, and the patient had never allowed himself to grieve. Flying, being in the air without control, was the symbol of his helplessness before death. The phobia was a small, manageable fear that replaced the vast, unmanageable one. Another patient seemed successful by every external metric, yet he was numb. In session, he confessed he felt like a character performing a role someone else had written. As we explored his life, it became clear he had never chosen. He had complied. He had lived in what Heidegger called the they, what Sartre called bad faith. His depression was not a defect. It was a protest from his unlived self. A third patient was consumed by loneliness despite being constantly online, constantly messaging. She had thousands of contacts and no intimacy. She realized painfully that connection is not the same as visibility. She had been trading depth for the illusion of being seen. When she began to risk real encounters, awkward, imperfect, uncurated, her anxiety spiked, but so did her aliveness. This is what existentialism offers your world, a refusal to confuse distraction with meaning. Your century has unprecedented tools for comfort and entertainment. You can scroll away discomfort. You can drown in information. You can keep your mind occupied every waking moment. And yet the givens do not disappear. Death still comes. Freedom still demands choices. Isolation still hums beneath noise. Meaninglessness still waits when the screens go dark. If existentialism is historically a philosophy, it is also, now, a practice. It is the practice of turning toward what you would rather avoid, not to wallow, but to wake up. So what do I tell people, finally, when they ask how to live? I tell them, notice what you are doing to avoid anxiety. Is it work? Alcohol? Rage? Perfection? Endless scrolling? Then ask, what truth is the avoidance protecting you from? I tell them, accept finitude, not as doom, but as urgency. If you had forever, you could postpone your life indefinitely. Because you do not have forever, the next honest choice matters. I tell them, build meaning through action. Values become real only when they cost you something. Time, attention, comfort, pride. I tell them, let relationships be places of encounter, not hiding. The goal is not to erase isolation, but to meet each other across it. And above all, I tell them what the existentialists, each in their own way, have been telling you for 2 centuries. You cannot be saved from existence, but you can be transformed by facing it. 8 voices, 1 thread. The self is not a thing you discover, but a life you take responsibility for, under the pressure of finitude, in the presence of others, without guarantees.
I have often thought that, whether we admit it or not, most of us are existentialists by circumstance before we are existentialists by conviction. We awaken each day into a world that does not come with instructions. We move through love, illness, ambition, disappointment, and death without any final commentary explaining what it all means. We live, as I see it, in a suspended state of unknowing. And it is precisely this condition that existential philosophy dares to face without flinching. When I first encountered the writings of Søren Kierkegaard, I was struck by his insistence that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. That phrase has never left me. Anxiety is not merely a clinical disturbance, it is the tremor that accompanies possibility. It is the recognition that nothing outside of us guarantees the shape of our lives. We are not handed a script. We are handed an open horizon. And yet something in us protests. I think religion at its core is a profound acknowledgement that something is wrong, something is off, not merely socially wrong or politically flawed, but cosmically dislocated. The world does not feel as it should. Suffering intrudes. Death interrupts. Innocence is betrayed. There is a wound in the structure of things. The ancient religious imagination responded not with indifference, but with myth, ritual, and revelation. We invented gods and heavens not because we were naive, but because we were honest about the ache. But existentialism asks a harder question. What if the ache does not come with a built-in cure? When Friedrich Nietzsche declared, "God is dead," he was not celebrating atheism in a shallow sense. He was diagnosing a crisis. If the old certainties no longer bind us, then the responsibility shifts. We cannot rely on inherited structures to rescue us from meaninglessness. We must create meaning ourselves or confront the abyss without anesthesia. That abyss, however, is not merely nihilism. As Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, man is condemned to be free. Condemned, not because freedom is undesirable, but because it cannot be escaped. Even refusing to choose is a choice. Even surrendering to dogma is an act of decision. We cannot step outside of responsibility. We are thrown into existence, as Martin Heidegger described it, and we must answer for what we make of it. In my own life, I have felt this tension acutely. There are moments when I long for a final voice to descend and clarify everything, to assure me that the wound has a purpose, that the fracture is part of a larger architecture, and yet I also sense that such certainty might rob me of something essential. If the meaning were guaranteed, would my striving still matter? If the ending were fixed, would my choices still tremble with significance? Existential philosophy does not deny the wound, it names it. It sits beside it. Albert Camus famously wrote, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart." He imagined Sisyphus happy, not because the rock stops rolling, but because defiance itself becomes meaning. The absurd condition, the clash between our longing for clarity and the universe's silence, does not eliminate dignity. It intensifies it. Perhaps religion and existentialism are not enemies after all. Religion says something is broken. Existentialism says we must live fully even if it remains broken. Religion invents redemption. Existentialism invents responsibility. Both begin with the same intuition. The world does not seamlessly satisfy the human heart. I do not claim to have resolved the tension. I suspect I never will. But I have come to see that the suspended state of unknowing is not a defect in my thinking. It is the human condition. We build temples, philosophies, art, science, each an attempt to respond to the wound. Some responses appeal to transcendence, others to revolt, others to authenticity. What unites them is this: we refuse to look away. And in that refusal, in the quiet courage to live without guarantees, I find something profoundly sacred.